my book, Closer to Home, Traces of a Mystical Journey, the seed was planted many, many years ago. Started being germinated in 1974 when I had the near-death experience. And then, years later, started flowering, blooming, blossoming. And I felt an urgency to get this into a form that could be shared with other people who might be having unusual experiences, similar or different from those that I experienced.
For all of you that don't know, my name is Winnie Nimrod. I am a beloved friend of Judith's, which we're here to celebrate the launch of her new book, Closer to Home, Traces of a Mystical Journey. And Judith is a crone in our community. She is now in her 84th year of life and shining brightly and putting this offering out into the world.
Thank you, Winnie.
So Judith, it's such a privilege introducing you. I can't wait to read your book and hear what you have to share with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, dear heart. Beautiful words. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here today. At a time like this in the world, it's especially important to gather with like-hearted women. Because when women gather together, having set the garment of personality aside, the truth of one's being can shine through, an offering of beauty, love, and power to a waiting world. I will be reading selected chapters from the book, and it'll be interspersed with additional material, additional episodes that aren't in the book. So, taken to the light. This time is the only time. This one is the only one. Why this time? Why this one? Created to meet the one. It seemed to begin in the fall of 1974. As a wife, mother, and artist, I became aware that my life needed a radical change. Those most often invited to dinner were my husband's friends. And so it was at one of these dinner parties that we were gathered around for hors d'oeuvres of sushi. I began to experience an increasingly rapid heartbeat, and lightheadedness in my body was turning the color of an eggplant. Over the course of 20 minutes or so, I experienced the sensation of enormous energy rushing out the top of my head. I could not feel my body and seemed to float to the bathroom to look at myself in the mirror. What I saw reflected was that my face and arms had turned a dark purple color, and I knew that something was very wrong. The heartbeat by now was just about uninterrupted. Elle was stir-frying the beef as I seemingly sensed that I was floating into the living room and announced to my husband that I needed to be taken to the ER. Well, that was obvious, and off we went. My appearance was such that no one at the hospital even requested the Blue Cross card. Almost immediately, they put me on a gurney and called the doctor while I heard a nurse say, "All her signs are off." And then I was no longer in the room. I was being propelled rapidly through a long, dark tunnel. Every now and then would come a lighted stop and a vignette from my life. And then the movement continued until the next vignette, like stations on a subway. This continued until the lit-up stops were almost continuous. And then the horizontal movement changed. Now from above, bits of memories and dreams snowed down like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Faster and faster they came. Then from above descended a magnetic pole that pulled all the pieces together into a perfect mandala, and no pieces were missing. I heard, "There are no mistakes, Everything you thought as error was necessary for the whole. This was your life, Judith Citrin. This repeated a second time, and then the movement changed back to a horizontal one, and the speed increased. The darkness was accompanied by a sound, unknown and yet familiar somehow. And way, way in the distance was a tiny dot of light, which I seemed to be moving toward. As I approached, it carried the essence of a love I had never known before. As I came closer and closer, I entered into a field of brilliant golden light and love that was nothing like personal love, yet was embracing me with utter acceptance of my totality. And again I heard, "There are no mistakes. Everything you thought as error was necessary for the whole. This was your life, Judith Citrin," and again it repeated. Just as I was about to merge into the light and the orgasmic ecstasy of that merging, a thought came into my consciousness. I must let my husband and son know to release me, that I am going home and it is perfect. As soon as that thought came, I began to move backward into the tunnel, a physically and emotionally agonizing movement away from the expansive light of love and into the darkness and isolation and constriction of an individuality. I came back seizing, gagging on the rubber tum depressor, freezing cold and in utter physical pain and grief, and shackled to the gurney. One of the doctors told me that a strange virus was no doubt coursing through my body, and that I should go home with the bottle of 120 milligram Valium my husband had gotten at the hospital pharmacy and forget what had happened to me, that I would no doubt have upper respiratory symptoms the next day, and that I should call my doctor and he would prescribe an antibiotic. So much for modern medicine. I flushed the Valium when I returned home from the, quote, medical church, end quote. Something within me knew that I had been given a taste of the real, although I had no context in which to hold the experience. And this jump start catalyzed a passionate search for truth that was to gain momentum throughout the ensuing years. The hospital's medical records of this event were never found. They had disappeared, leaving me with my memory and the impact on my life the experience precipitated. I was filled with wonder and an all-abiding reassurance that I'd been given a tremendous and mysterious gift. While life became less predictable, my sense of it as a journey to the unknown deepened. Several years passed, and somehow I knew to attend a lecture presented at Northwestern University by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. It was on that evening that my life once again was shocked awake. What had happened to me in 1974 now had a name: near-death experience. The ground beneath my feet was no longer solid. The dark side of power. Intrepid traveler, it's of no dire consequence that you have fear. It's time to open up the box that you've kept closed so long. Untie the string and know you are of me. How I got to Morocco was through a most unexpected route, Anna Isnin. That I had a friendship with her was even more astonishing. But earlier, in 1971, I came across her writing after seeing a rebroadcast of a program called Realities on Chicago's public television station. It was an interview with Henry Miller and Anna Is. Henry mentioned her name, which I recognized from her introduction to his Tropic of Cancer, having read it when first published in this country. Actually, I had read that whole circle's books, including Gore Vidal, Lawrence Durrell, and others, without knowing that there was a thread between them. I was electrified just hearing Anais's name and seeing her. It was so thrilling to me that I couldn't stay in my studio and watch television. I was doing little busy things in the kitchen and periodically returning to watch. I had the feeling that there was something cataclysmic about to happen as a result of this recognition, and went to the Wilmette Library where they had Volume 2 of Neen's diary available. I read it, and even before I went searching for the other volumes, I wrote to her. She responded by return mail, and that's how I met her. Not long after, I learned that Anna East was coming to Chicago to lecture at Northwestern University and have several interviews, and so I asked if she'd allow me to have a brunch for her. I was also able to get her on Channel 11 program called Bookbeat. The producer and host didn't like Anna East at all. He adamantly didn't like her. But the director, Lou Abraham, was a friend of mine from when I'd been on the staff for 6 years, and as a favor to me, put her on his program. So I met Anna East at Channel 11 those many years ago in 1971. There she was, walking up the steps with her black cape and black beret, looking like a very young woman, and we literally connected in the ladies' room. She said she needed eyebrows put on and asked me to get the makeup person for her. There was no such person at this local station, so she asked me for my eyebrow pencil, which I did not have, and to fix her eyebrows before she went on camera. I did so, challenged by an unsharpened stub of an eyebrow pencil begged from the receptionist. The next day she came to the house with her entourage and several of my artist friends. At the buffet, she whispered to me that she loved the food but had cancer and couldn't eat it. I had just found my true mother and mentor, and she was probably going to die. For many years, we spoke on the phone and visited, in Chicago and New York. A strong bond was forged that lasted until her death. She had asked me to join her on a visit to Fez, Morocco, arranged by Travel and Leisure magazine. And although I did not go at that time, the seed was planted, and a place that I had never even located on a map became the most potent magnet in my life. After years of annual visits and working in a studio behind the Bahia Palace, a body of drawings were produced and exhibited at the National Museum. And then, in 1980, I found myself in Rabat attempting to hail a taxi to get to the Moroccan Ministry of Culture. The meeting had been arranged to discuss the possibility of an exchange between American and Moroccan artists, as well as the formation of a public television station. I was in way over my head and experiencing an unaccustomed surge of power and the sense of opening to a life of limitless possibilities, invulnerability, and potency. In other words, major inflation. Well, that bubble was about to explode in my face. After almost an hour of fruitless hailing and nervous about being late for the appointment with the minister, a taxi filled with veiled women stopped for me. As I rode endlessly through unfamiliar areas of Rabat, the sky progressively darkening as we dropped the women off one by one, having no language with which to communicate with the driver, anxiety was mounting. The darkening continued. And then the driver came to a halt. A giant of a man stood in front of the taxi screaming at the driver. Children poured from the buildings as mothers peered from the windows. The giant pulled the driver out and was waving a knife at him. The feral children swarmed the car roof and sides, rocking it, while others opened the door to the back seat where I was paralyzed with fear. And then they began pulling at me from both directions, and I knew that I was going to die. Something within me began to pray to God and to evoke the teachers who had opened me to my deeper being. Time slowed down and then stopped. When I became aware of time again, the driver somehow was able to pull away from his attacker in time to grab the children, pushing them out and locking the doors. Then he was once again pounced upon. Everything began to move, but in slow motion. The sky lightening, the children backing off the top and away from the sides of the car, going back inside their dwellings, the mothers retreating from the windows. I offered the driver all my money to give the giant as ransom, but it was refused. The driver, free now of the giant, got into the car and with hands shaking, offered me a cigarette, lighting one for himself. I didn't smoke. He began to drive away and somehow communicated to me the apparent cause of the event. The giant had claimed that the car had run over his foot. I wrote down the name of the district. I was told at the American Embassy offices, where in shock I collapsed into the arms of friends in the diplomatic corps, that no American had ever come out of this area alive. It had been a miracle and an unforgettable teaching to me about the dark side of power. Isn't in the book. Shortly after returning from India, I went to Sky High Ranch to rest from the exhaustion of the trek and then to help with the community. One evening, December 6th, 1982, after the dinner in silence, I met Marshall Summers. Moira, you will connect with this. Marshall later became a world teacher and was there on retreat as he was being bombarded by three distinct energies which were teaching him about other dimensions of reality. Walking along the railroad tracks in the dark, I was being told my whole life by him. Then, in his room, each of us on a bed, the bedroom filled up with dancing lights and sound, as he tossed me a lined notebook and a pencil and said, "Write down what you hear." And this is what I heard and wrote down. "It is no accident that you are here tonight. This has been planned for you both, and now its time has come. Be not afraid, my child, for I am leading you both to be my messengers for good. There need be trust and confidence and perfect harmony together. For this work you have agreed to serve as one. Have no fear. You have both been prepared before to be the instrument for my word, and once again are together in me. Do you not see the perfection of my ways? Where there is pure light, there is no shadow. There is no guilt for each of you. In my house there is just love, and there you dwell with me. And now can you see the truth of this? In thy Father's house is perfect harmony, and there you dwell. This is no time to question. The radiance is already felt. You are together for mutual support, and have been before and will be again, and this is my good for you." End quote. It seemed that suddenly it was daylight. My body was in extreme pain, as though I'd been electrocuted. Marshall put me in a cold shower to break the electric current, he said. This had happened the year before when I was at Esalen Institute. After an LSD session prescribed to move the energy blockage from my heart, which was causing angina, my body was totally stiff as if electrocuted. I was told that I looked frightening, and I was extremely fractured energetically. Love happens. Throughout my adult life, I wanted to be anything other than like the part of my mother that was fearful, unassertive, and passively controlling. She was also generous and loving, which were qualities I admired. This motivated my inner pusher to achieve, which gave my parents great pleasure and pride. One day she came into this reality and spoke about, quote, the privilege of memory, end quote, that she could be with her brother Bill or anyone or be anywhere. And then she went back to that place beyond, which I now recognize as the bridge between this veiled world and the next. I was flooded with forgiveness for what I had perceived as her insatiable neediness, as well as deepest gratitude and love for her playing to perfection such a role for my soul's growth. And as she was dying, it was as though she was in labor to birth into non-being. I saw her original face. God, the beloved, will do whatever it takes to wake us up from the cultural trance and to recognize one's essential wholeness, holiness, and love. Thank you. How about some questions?
And I was just wondering why you refer to them as authentic and what the meaning of authentic ritual is.
By authentic, I mean that they were spontaneous, that they were not rehearsed or taught to me by someone. They just evolved naturally. That's what I mean by authenticity. Thank you. Yes.
Judith, thank you. I would like some advice about meditation. There's always a problem with chatter and feeling that energy block. And meditating for years, the chatter is energy sucking. And I wonder if you have any advice about how to deal with that while you're meditating.
Well, maybe it would be useful for you to consider whatever you're passionate about, your meditation practice. If you have a craft, or if you like to go for long walks, and not stress about sitting quietly and quieting the mind, which doesn't work for a lot of people. So I have a close friend who is an artist in Santa Fe who's been with some very strong teachers, including the one that my husband and I are with. And she makes art, and that's her meditation. Yes?
So as a wife and mother, how were you able to maintain that commitment to your own journey? I mean, I know there were ebbs and flows, but I'm very curious about that.
It's like there was no choice. It was the same as when I was making the art, and relatives would say, "Oh, how fortunate you are that you have a hobby." Hobby? I was compelled because I was getting information for myself from the pieces that I was making. So I made big dinners, had dinner parties, made cookies for my son's friends for after school. I did all that. I didn't even question it. I also had a very supportive husband in Phil Citrin, may he rest in peace. And it wasn't an effort. And I was blessed. I mean, it was just my great good fortune and grace that came upon me that allowed me to fulfill functions while tending to my own inner journey. I had 10 years of Jungian analysis, and so I was very focused on recording my dreams, and it was natural for me, I'll put it that way. And I had a place to go to for many years in the high desert, and I wrote about it. It was called Sky High Ranch. I had a place to go and be in community and work. I mean, I cooked, I worked with people who were there on retreat with physical problems, and I had the support. I was contained. And so twice a year I would go to Sky High Ranch for a month each time for many years. And then when Richard Moss, who is the Richard in the book, when he took over Sky High Ranch, I continued going and being part of the community. And it doesn't exist anymore, but the timing was right for me to have that support. It's nice to just to hang out, and I know it's very challenging to let go of the inner critic, very challenging, and maybe it finally gets worn out, and it's like, thank you, you served me, goodbye, and then just be able to be in emptiness, which is the truth, and just wait and see what wants to come in, how you might be used in service. Yeah. That's it.
So excited.
It's lovely.
It's a treasure, you know. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mary Jo is M.A.
So glad to see you after so long. That's who I make it out to. People need to honor themselves and the privilege to be embodied and to be a vessel of love. That's what I hope for. I am Gaia. Traveling through India and trekking in the Himalayas was not a lifelong dream of mine. No. But in the fall of 1982, when Richard asked if I would join him and a group on a 3-week adventure to northern India and Nepal, I didn't hesitate for long. I did ask him if there would be any of the rope suspension bridges my friend Hunter had showed me in her slides of a similar trip. I was terrified by the bridges over huge chasms. Heights had always induced panic in me, but Richard thought that we would encounter no such bridges. The first day, after arriving in Delhi, we were the guests of Darshan Singh, the head of the Science of Spirituality, at his ashram. Richard was being honored as the invited speaker, and the program lasted for many hours. A huge number of people were in attendance, and hundreds more were being fed on a daily basis and given free homeopathic and allopathic treatment. During a private meeting with the Master, I joined him in meditation at his request and heard the words, "And now for the next half hour, the vehicle will be shattered." While in Kashmir, I acted on the suggestion of Stan Groff to go to the Shalimar Gardens ashram of the master of the Shaivite order of Hinduism, Lakshmanju. Stan had told me that Muktananda went to this man for darshan, sitting before the master. I could find no telephone number, so just showed up with Richard and his wife and a friend. A kind and regal man, Lakshmanju said that we should return the next day as his followers from Belgium were coming shortly. That wasn't possible, as we were flying to Ladakh the next day to begin the trek. As I apologized for just stopping by, I looked at him and suddenly he became a huge column of light. The indescribable awe that I felt caused me to be silent and not speak of this. As planned, the next day we flew from Kashmir to Ladakh to begin our trek in the Himalayas with a band of people who wanted to travel with Richard. I had been preparing my utterly non-athletic body for many months with yoga classes and long hikes in anticipation of this stretch, and was relatively confident of my ability to move through any resistances. As we progressed on the selected path, the weather ranged from snow and cold to rain and heat. Many in the group became very ill. A woman had eaten an apple from a tree in Ladakh, and shortly after her tongue grew black hair all over it and she was burning with fever. True. Another woman developed bacillary dysentery, and yet another developed pneumonia. And the intrepid travelers kept plodding on. And then my husband suffered a severe kidney stone attack. Because he was too large to fit on the back of a yak to get down the mountain, I I was told to contact the Nepalese military to fly him to Bangkok for treatment. Overnight, his hair had turned white. I was more than freaked out, especially after my own 2 days of bursting pain from altitude sickness in Ladakh, having ascended to 11,000 feet in a tiny plane from sea level in Kashmir. And that's when it happened. There, at 14,000 feet, we encountered the first of 13 rope suspension bridges. The shock I felt incited a barely contained rage. No one else in the group seemed to be frightened about the bridges in this steep mountainous region, but for me, this was a no-exit situation and terror gripped me. If the bridges were to collapse, the fall would be from thousands of feet to the rocks below. Yet the rage fueled my strength, and suddenly I felt a force behind me pushing me rapidly ahead of all the others for the next 3 days. I found that if I was alone crossing the suspension bridges, many of which had large gaps both in the woven rope and broken wood surfaces, there wasn't the horrific reverberation from those ahead of and behind me, and I could just skim across and continue my vengeful, energy-fueled pace. I realized it didn't really matter if I fell into the chasm below, as I was already in a death space, having known that my marriage would soon be ending and life as I knew it was coming to an end. My husband had recovered sufficiently to be able to slowly trek back down the mountainous path, eventually arriving in Kathmandu, where I encountered Swami Rama playing tennis at our hotel. Actually, it was more like badminton. The Yak and Yeti Hotel. The Swami told me to bring Phil to his ashram the next day, and he would help him. Phil refused to go. So I hired a driver and went with a friend. I was wearing high heels, unaware that we would be crossing a river on a log and circumambulating a high hill at the top of which was the ashram. I seemed to be confronted with yet another fearful challenge. The heels came off, and with the help from both the driver and my friend, I made it across. At the ashram, we were served tea under a lovely pergola and offered cookies made by Swami Rama, who years earlier had told me to eat no sugar or white flour. So at first I refused, feeling tested. That didn't last long. And eventually I scarfed a good number of the delicious forbidden sweets. Before leaving, I was given 2 homeopathic remedies for my husband. He took the first one before we left for the flight to Delhi. The second one, which he took in the hotel room in Delhi, provoked an enormous reaction, with Phil screaming, "The bastard, he's trying to kill me," as his sweat drenched the bed with seemingly gallons of water. When we arrived at the airport for the flight to New York, Phil showed Richard his hands, which had deep open cracks in them. Richard took Phil's hands in his, and moments later the skin closed without even a trace of the former condition. Phil asked why Richard hadn't done this earlier. The reply was, "You didn't ask." Upon arriving back in Chicago, a visit to the hospital and an examination showed no evidence of kidney stones. A healing had happened. In 1988, a very difficult summer, early morning I see coins all over the beach and pick them up. Eventually I say, pardon me, "I have enough money, now show me love." And subsequently I find a beach full of little hearts each day, which I collect and send in letters to my friends. In 2000, Tom and I are in Marrakesh, sitting at the pool of our hotel when we see an old woman come out of her room. She has on a black bathing suit, is quite stout with short white hair, and is the image of Irina Tweedy, our teacher's teacher. Tom says, "If it is Mrs. Tweedy, she will turn around and look at me. She does so. It chills. We drive up into the high Atlas Mountains with reservations at a recommended hotel. Along the way, we pick up an older Berber man who is hitchhiking. We've never done this before. In my barely adequate French, I tell him where we're going, asking for directions. He says we should stay at another place owned by a French couple. After dropping him off at his home and checking out the reserved place, finding it not at all what we want, we go to the suggested auberge where across from our beds is a poster of Louis Armstrong. What's particularly startling about this is at Mrs. Tweedy's cremation, she had requested "What a Wonderful World," sung by Louis Armstrong. When I shared this with Llewellyn, her teacher, he said, "You were being protected." When we came down from the mountains, traveling to Essaouira after a day or two, we were suddenly treated very badly. Subsequent reservations canceled, and when we returned to Marrakesh, the hotel that had for years treated me with roses and fruit baskets and a luxury room gave us a chauffeur's room, tiny, shabby, and dirty. We had a very difficult time returning to the airport, treated as enemies. Finally finding out that the ship Cole had been bombed and America was the enemy.